Fire that ER nurse!
Gavin Mercer's voice cut through the emergency department like a blade. I want her gone. Now. He was one of the most powerful men in the city, and he expected to be obeyed. The nurse he wanted removed. Mara Ellison didn't argue. She didn't even look at him. She was staring at the monitor, reading something the doctors had already missed. She was being escorted out of the unit. She was the only one who could see what was about to kill his daughter. Then the windows shook. An Army Black Hawk descended onto the rooftop. A brigadier general stepped off and walked past every doctor, every administrator, every billionaire in the building. He only asked one question. Where is Mara Ellison? If you've ever felt like the most capable person in the room and been ignored anyway, this story is for you. Hit subscribe so you don't miss what happens next. We post new stories every week and they only get better from here. The emergency department had been running at capacity since 9 o'clock. 3 separate accidents on the interstate had sent 22 patients through the doors in under 90 minutes, and the floor moved, the way it always moved during a mass casualty event, loud, fast, and held together by the thinnest margin of controlled chaos. Every bay was occupied. Every nurse was moving. The overhead lights buzzed at a frequency that no one noticed anymore, because noticing it required attention that couldn't be spared. Mara Ellison had worked this floor for 11 years. She knew which IV line would kink on cart 3, which crash cart battery was running low, which attending physician needed the right instrument placed in his hand before he realized he needed it. She knew the sound of a bay that was about to lose someone before any monitor said so. Nobody had taught her these things. She had simply been paying attention long enough that the emergency department had become a language she read without effort, the way a person reads a road they've driven 1,000 times in the dark. To her colleagues, Mara was the nurse you wanted on shift when things went wrong. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't freeze. She moved through crisis with a steadiness built not from inexperience, but from something deeper and harder to name, the kind of composure that only comes from having already been in rooms where the stakes were absolute. Her patients responded to that calm. Even unconscious ones seemed to settle when she was close. Her personal file was unremarkable. 11 years of clean evaluations, no formal complaints. A steady accumulation of commendations she never mentioned in conversation. Her co-workers knew she was good. They didn't know much else. She never talked about herself. If a question got too personal, she didn't deflect with a lie, she simply redirected so smoothly that the other person would walk away having learned something useful and forgotten what they'd originally asked. Wade Calloway was the only person on the floor who had ever looked at Mara the way someone looks at a thing they almost recognize. Wade ran security for the night shift, a retired Army sergeant who had done 2 tours and then spent 15 years standing between hospital staff and everything that wanted to go wrong. He had seen enough people under real pressure to know the difference between someone trained to stay calm and someone who simply hadn't encountered enough yet to be frightened. Mara was the former. He was certain of it. He just couldn't place where that training came from. There were small things he'd cataloged without meaning to. A dog tag on a thin chain beneath her scrub top, old and worn at the edges, the way metal gets after years of field use. A scar along her left wrist, pale and long-heeled, running at an angle that didn't come from any accident he could picture. And the way she arranged her emergency cart, not just organized, but sequenced in a specific order that matched no hospital protocol he'd ever seen, yet somehow always put the right instrument in reach before anyone asked for it. The way she stood during a trauma activation, weight slightly forward, eyes moving in a systematic sweep across the patient, the monitors, the room, and back again. Not someone running a checklist. Someone running an assessment in an environment where the wrong answer carried consequences she'd already been taught to take seriously. Wade had never asked her about any of it. He was not a man who asked questions he didn't expect to get answered. Earlier that evening, a first-year resident named Jason Merritt had worked the same stretch of floor as Mara for 4 hours. He was sharp and eager in the way that first-year residents are before the system finishes filing down their instincts, and he had noticed, without quite knowing what to do with the observation, that Mara consistently identified patient deterioration 2 to 3 minutes before the monitoring equipment flagged it. He had filed the observation away and said nothing because the attending had already made the calls, and he hadn't yet developed the professional confidence to push back against them. The ambulance came in fast at 11:47. The crew had radioed ahead female mid-20s, high-speed collision, multiple impact points, responsive at the scene, but declining. The team was already positioned when the doors came open. Mara reached the gurney first. Audrey Mercer was 26 years old and had been hit on the driver's side at highway speed. Her vitals on arrival sat in a range. The department read as serious but manageable, the kind of presentation that called for imaging, close observation, and a controlled escalation plan. The attending physician, Dr. Carl Harlan, ordered a CT scan protocol and began directing the team toward imaging prep. It was the right call by the numbers. Everyone in the room agreed with it. Mara started her own assessment the moment the gurney locked into Bay 1. She worked quietly, her hands moving across Audrey's abdomen with careful precision. Something made her slow at the lower quadrant. She repeated the motion. She looked at the fingertips. She looked at the monitor. She looked at Audrey's face. Gavin Mercer arrived 8 minutes later. He came through the ambulance bay with 2 associates who were clearly not hospital staff and found the first administrator he saw with the quiet, absolute authority of a man who had never once been told that the rules applied to him the way they applied to everyone else. Gavin was 61 years old and had spent 3 decades building a real estate empire that had reshaped the city's skyline. He was used to rooms adjusting to his presence. He was used to people moving before he reached them. I identified Audrey through the glass and turned immediately toward whoever was in charge. Dr. Harlan introduced himself, explained the CT protocol, and began walking Gavin through the plan. Gavin listened for approximately 45 seconds. Then he looked past Harlan and noticed Mara standing at the bedside with the portable ultrasound unit already in her hands. Harlan caught the look and spoke before the situation could develop further. He told Mara that the imaging order was already placed, that the patient would be moved in the next few minutes, and that there was no clinical indication for a bedside ultrasound at this stage. His tone was measured the tone of a senior physician closing a conversation, not opening one. Mara looked at him steadily. She said she had concerns she would like to rule out first. Harlan told her to step back and let the team follow the plan. What Gavin Mercer saw was a nurse who was slowing things down. He didn't have the clinical context to read it any other way. His daughter was injured and declining, and someone on the hospital staff was standing between his daughter and the people he expected to be helping her. He turned to the administrator beside him, a man named Daniel Frost, 14 years with the institution, and delivered his verdict in a voice that carried across the entire department. "Fire that ER nurse," Gavin said. "I want her gone. Now." Daniel Frost looked at the man in front of him. He looked at the donor plaques in his peripheral memory, Gavin Mercer's name on 2 of them. He made the calculation that most people in his position make under that kind of pressure. He turned toward the nursing station, began the paperwork, and quietly radioed Wade Calloway to have security ready to escort Mara out of the department as soon as the handoff was complete. Every physician, nurse, and technician within earshot heard what had just happened. Several of them looked at Mara. Mara was still looking at Audrey. The numbers on the monitor were not alarming. That was the problem. They sat in the range that told a room full of experienced clinicians that the situation was serious but not yet critical, the range that allowed for a protocol to be followed without urgency. Mara had stood in rooms like this before. She knew what it looked like when the numbers said one thing and the patient's body was doing something else entirely, heading somewhere the instruments hadn't caught up to yet. Audrey's fingertips had taken on a color that wasn't quite right. Not severe enough to photograph, not obvious enough to register from across the room. But there, if you were looking at the right place with the right kind of experience. Her heart rate had shifted in the last 4 minutes, not dramatically, but in a pattern that didn't fit a patient who was stable and trending toward imaging. And her response to abdominal palpation had been slightly specifically wrong in a way that the current diagnosis didn't account for. Mara placed the ultrasound probe against Audrey's abdomen. She did it quietly, without announcement, while Dr. Harlan was updating Gavin on the timeline. She moved the probe in a slow, deliberate sweep, adjusted the angle twice, and found what she had suspected. On the screen in the lower quadrant, there was fluid where there should have been none. Not a large volume, not yet. But it had a direction it was heading, and that direction did not end well. Daniel Frost appeared at the edge of the bay and told Mara she needed to hand off her patients and come with him. Wade had positioned himself near the bay entrance as instructed, not aggressive. Just present the way, security is present, when an administrator needs something to happen and doesn't want resistance. Mara straightened. She looked at Daniel with the composed expression she'd worn all night and began handing off her other patients one by one, going through each case methodically, making sure the oncoming nurse understood exactly what to watch for and why. She didn't rush it. Each patient got the same attention they would have gotten if nothing else were happening. But before she stepped away from Bay 1, she turned back to Dr. Harlan. Her voice was clear and level-pitched to be heard without making it a confrontation. "Trauma 1 still needs to be watched," Mara said. "There's free fluid in the lower quadrant. I want that documented before I leave." Harlan started to respond. Audrey's blood pressure dropped. Not catastrophically, not yet. But the monitor registered the shift, and the number on the screen was measurably lower than the reading from 4 minutes earlier, and the direction it was moving was not toward recovery. The room changed in the way trauma rooms change when a situation reclassifies itself. Harlan turned back to the monitor. A technician called out the updated reading. 2 nurses repositioned without being told. Mara was already back at the bedside. She placed the ultrasound probe in Harlan's hand without a word and guided it to the position where the fluid was visible on screen. He looked at the image. His expression shifted, the particular shift of a clinician who has just been shown something he cannot argue with, delivered by someone he had been trying to dismiss 30 seconds ago. The CT scan was canceled. Audrey Mercer was rerouted directly to the operating room. From somewhere above, the hospital growing louder, with each passing second came a sound that didn't belong to anything in the department's normal rotation, not an ambulance, not one of the trauma center's own aircraft. It was heavier and more deliberate, the distinctive percussion of military rotors, and it was descending toward the roof with an urgency that had nothing to do with the patients already inside. Wade Calloway heard it first. He was standing near the exterior security panel when the notification came through. An incoming aircraft requesting immediate rooftop clearance flagged as military priority, operating on a frequency this hospital almost never received. Wade had heard that frequency exactly twice in his life. Both times had been on a military installation. He looked up at the ceiling as though he could see through 4 floors of concrete to whatever was descending. Then he looked across the department at Mara Ellison, who was calmly ensuring that Audrey's chart was complete and accurate before the surgical team took her, still doing her job, even now, even after being handed the paperwork that was supposed to end her night. Wade had been trying to place what he recognized about Mara Ellison for the better part of 2 years, standing in the emergency department, with the sound of military rotors coming through the walls. He thought he was beginning to understand. The operating room took Audrey Mercer at 12 minutes past midnight. Dr. Harlan walked the surgical team through the updated assessment. As they moved the fluid on ultrasound, the pressure drop, the rerouted plan. His voice was steady and professional, and gave no indication that the decision to cancel the CT scan had cost him anything personally to make. That was the nature of the work. When the clinical picture changed, you changed with it. You didn't spend time in the hallway accounting for your ego when someone was bleeding on a table. What he didn't say, and what everyone in that corridor already understood, was that the fluid on the ultrasound had been identified by a nurse who had been standing at that bedside after being told to step away. A nurse whose name was currently on a suspension document that Daniel Frost had personally walked to the nursing station 20 minutes ago. Gavin Mercer had watched Audrey disappear through the OR doors without being able to follow. He stood in the hallway with the helpless stillness of a man whose every instinct was to act and who had run out of actions available to him. His hands were in his coat pockets. His eyes stayed on the closed doors long after there was anything left to see. The Black Hawk touched down on the rooftop at 12:19. The sound had been building for several minutes, not the familiar rhythm of the hospital's own air transport, but something heavier, more deliberate, the kind of rotors that suggested a machine built for purposes other than medical evacuation. Security had already received the clearance request and passed it up the chain. Nobody on the administrative side had an answer for why a military aircraft was requesting priority landing at a civilian hospital on a Tuesday night in the middle of a trauma shift. Wade Calloway took the stairwell to the rooftop level and watched it come down. He counted the personnel stepping off, 4 in uniform, moving in the tight, coordinated way that men move when they've spent years operating as a unit rather than a group. And behind them a man in his late 50s who wore the rank of brigadier general, the way people wear a thing they've stopped thinking about, because it has simply become part of who they are. Everett Rourke surveyed the rooftop with the practiced efficiency of someone assessing an unfamiliar environment, then moved toward the door without waiting for anyone to show him where it was. Wade stepped aside and held the door. Rourke didn't acknowledge it the way a civilian would. He simply walked through, which was its own kind of acknowledgement between men who understood the same language. Wade fell into step a distance behind and stayed there. The group came off the elevator onto the emergency department floor at 12:23. The effect was immediate. Conversation stopped. 2 nurses near the central station turned. Jason Merritt, who had been typing notes at a workstation near Bay 3, looked up and didn't look back down. Gavin Mercer, still positioned near the OR corridor, registered the group's arrival and straightened a reflex response to authority presenting itself, even from a man who spent most of his life being the authority in any given room. Daniel Frost moved to intercept. He introduced himself with the practiced composure of a hospital administrator who had handled difficult arrivals before and asked how he could direct the general and his team. Rourke looked at him with the courteous disinterest of a man who had already identified that Daniel Frost was not the person he was looking for. "Where is Mara Ellison?" Rourke said. Daniel blinked. He said he wasn't sure he understood. Was there a patient they were here to see? A security matter? He could connect them with the appropriate department if they could explain the nature of the visit. Rourke didn't repeat himself. He simply looked past Daniel toward the department floor, scanning the bays with the same systematic sweep that Wade had once watched Mara use across a trauma room. And there was something in the similarity of that motion that made the hairs on Wade's forearms stand up without explanation. Mara was at the far end of the floor, checking medications for a patient in Bay 7. She had the chart in her left hand and was cross-referencing a label with the quiet, unhurried focus of someone who had mentally compartmentalized everything else that was happening on this floor tonight. The suspension document, the operating room, the billionaire standing 40 feet away and set it aside to finish what was in front of her. Rourke walked toward her. The personnel between them moved without being told to. It wasn't fear. It was the instinctive recognition that something significant was occurring and that the appropriate response was to get out of the way of it. Rourke stopped in front of Mara. She looked up from the chart. Nothing in her expression suggested she was surprised, which was itself a kind of answer to a question nobody had asked yet. The general came to attention. Then he saluted. The emergency department went completely quiet. It was not a perfunctory gesture, not the casual acknowledgement of someone going through a social motion. It was the precise held salute of a senior officer rendering formal respect to someone who had earned it in a context that most of the people in this hallway would never have access to. He held it for a full 3 seconds before lowering his hand. "Ms. Ellison," Rourke said, "we came for you." Mara's eyes moved to the surgical status board on the wall above the nursing station. Bay 1 Audrey Mercer was listed as in progress. "I still have patients," Mara said. Rourke looked at the board. He looked back at her. Something in his face settled into an expression that was not quite a smile but carried a similar quality, the recognition of a person behaving exactly as expected. "Then we wait," he said. Gavin Mercer had not moved. He stood at the edge of the OR corridor and watched a brigadier general salute the woman he had ordered, removed from his daughter's care less than an hour ago. The security officer he had asked to escort Mara out of the department was now standing several feet behind the general's group, watching the same scene with an expression Gavin couldn't fully read. Not surprise. Something more like confirmation. The surgical suite called down at 12:31. A charge nurse named Patricia took the call and wrote quickly on the clipboard. Additional blood product, vascular instrument, set rapid infusion equipment, possible technique, modification in progress. She read the list to the floor and began coordinating. It was a complicated request under any circumstances, and the pace at which it needed to be fulfilled left no margin for confusion. Mara had already begun moving before Patricia finished speaking. She went to the supply corridor and brought out a cart that she had pre-staged 30 minutes ago, positioned specifically for this kind of escalation, stocked in an order that corresponded to the sequence in which the surgical team would need each item. She cross-checked the blood product against the reservation log and found a discrepancy in the backup type notation, a clerical mismatch that would not have caused an immediate crisis, but would have created delay and confusion at the worst possible moment. She corrected it and flagged it for the charge desk. She checked the seal on the blood cooler and found it intact. She pulled the vascular set and confirmed the contents against the surgical team's standing preference, then had it ready at the elevator before the OR called down a second time. Gavin watched from the corridor. He had been watching for several minutes, without meaning to, without a conscious decision to observe Mara rather than stare at the OR doors. But there was something about the way she moved through those preparations that made it difficult to look away. She wasn't hurrying. She wasn't performing. She was operating with a kind of deep, precise efficiency that suggested she had not simply anticipated this request, but had anticipated it accurately enough to have already prepared the response before it arrived. Wade Calloway came to stand near Gavin, not beside him exactly, but close enough that they were occupying the same stretch of hallway. They stood in silence for a moment. Gavin's eyes remained on Mara. Does she always work like that? Gavin asked. He didn't look at Wade when he said it. Wade watched Mara check the seal on a second blood cooler, tilt it slightly to confirm the integrity of the contents, and set it on the cart in the exact position the transport nurse would need to reach it first. She takes the hard shifts, Wade said. Stays when things go bad. Helps the ones who are struggling. He kept his eyes on the far end of the corridor. And she almost never talks about herself. Gavin didn't respond immediately. Wade spoke again more quietly, almost to himself. I trained at Fort Campbell. Spent 3 years there before I separated. A beat. I've seen people move like that before. The way she handles equipment. The way she reads a room before anything happens in it. He let it rest there. Not in a hospital. Gavin finally turned his head and looked at Wade directly. Wade didn't add anything. He didn't need to. The phone at the nursing station rang at 12:44. Patricia answered, and her face changed in the specific way that faces change when information arrives that requires immediate action and leaves no room for the normal buffer of professional composure. She turned and said 2 words to the floor, losing pressure, and the department accelerated around her. In the operating room, Audrey Mercer's blood pressure had dropped below a threshold the surgical team could sustain on the current approach. They were shifting strategy. The timeline was compressing. Every minute of delay in receiving the right materials was a minute the table couldn't afford. Mara was already on the phone with the OR team, walking them through the cart she had pre-staged, confirming which items were ready, in what configuration, and what else could be prepared in the next 90 seconds if they told her what direction they were going. Her voice was the same voice she'd used all night. Level specific and completely without the tremor that enters a person's speech when they are frightened. Daniel Frost appeared at the edge of the nursing station. I had a single sheet of paper in his hand, the formal suspension document now signed and administratively complete, effective immediately. He set it on the counter in front of Mara without speaking, because he was a man who understood that words in this moment would cost him something he couldn't afford either way. The document sat there under the overhead light. Mara had the OR team on the line. She had the cart positioned and ready, and she was the only person on this floor who knew the exact sequence in which she had prepared it. Which case was first, which line ran to which port, which item would be needed before the surgical team knew they needed it. If she set the phone down and walked away, the person who picked it up would be starting from the beginning with a cart they didn't assemble in a situation that had no more time to spare. She looked at the document. She looked at the phone in her hand. She looked at the board on the wall that still read Bay 1 in progress. She placed the suspension document on the counter face down and kept talking. Across the corridor, Everett Rourke had moved to stand near Gavin Mercer, without announcement. Both men were watching the nursing station. Rourke spoke in a voice low enough that it wasn't addressed to the room. She did this before, Rourke said, in places that will never appear in any report you could access. He didn't elaborate. He didn't look at Gavin when he said it, and he didn't seem to require any particular response. Gavin looked at the woman on the phone, the woman who had just been handed the document that ended her career and had set it down face first to keep doing her job, and he understood enough. I didn't say anything. There was nothing available to say that wouldn't have sounded insufficient. He turned back toward the OR doors and stood there in the silence of a man who is beginning the slow, difficult work of understanding exactly what he had done. The OR doors opened at 1:42 in the morning. Dr. Harlan came through first. He had his mask pulled down around his neck and his gloves already removed, and he walked with the particular gait of a surgeon, coming off a difficult case not defeated, but emptied in the way that long, high-stakes work empties a person. Gavin Mercer was moving toward him before the doors had fully swung open. He crossed the corridor in 4 steps and stopped directly in front of Harlan, his face carrying everything he hadn't been able to say for the past hour. Harlan looked past him. He looked at Mara Ellison, who was standing at the nursing station, finishing a documentation entry with the same focused attention she had given every task tonight. Harlan walked toward her, and the small crowd that had gathered in the hallway, nurses Jason Merritt near the workstation, where he'd spent the last hour unable to concentrate on anything else. Wade Calloway near the far wall, Rourke and his personnel still positioned near the elevator bank registered the direction of that walk and understood what it meant before a single word was spoken. Harlan stopped in front of Mara. He spoke clearly in a voice he didn't lower because what he had to say was not something he intended to say quietly. He told her that the surgical team had found the bleeding source in the lower left quadrant exactly where her ultrasound had indicated. He told her that the initial CT protocol, if followed, would have added between 18 and 22 minutes to the timeline before the source was identified. At the rate Audrey had been losing pressure, those minutes would not have been recoverable. He told her that her insistence on that bedside assessment had changed the entire course of what happened in that operating room tonight. Then he said the 2 words Gavin Mercer had been standing in this hallway, waiting to hear since midnight. "She's stable." Gavin's shoulders dropped a half-inch. It was the only visible sign of what moved through him in that moment, a man who had spent his entire adult life maintaining composure in rooms where composure was a form of power, and who was now reaching the outer limit of what composure could contain. General Rourke stepped forward after Harlan returned to the surgical suite to complete his notes. He addressed the hallway without preamble, in the measured tone of someone who had decided in advance exactly how much he was going to say and intended to honor that decision, regardless of how many questions were left unanswered by it. He said that Mara Ellison had served as a combat medic. He said that the specifics of her service record were classified and would remain so, and that he was not in a position to elaborate beyond what he had just offered. He said that when she separated from service, she had declined every position she was offered that would have placed her behind a desk or in front of a camera. She had returned to emergency care because that was where the work was. As far as Rourke was concerned, that was all anyone in this hallway needed to know. He said it without ceremony. The way a man states facts he considers self-evident. Jason Merritt crossed the hallway and stood in front of Mara. He said he should have spoken up earlier, that he had seen some of the same signs she'd seen during the initial assessment and had talked himself out of acting on them because the attending had already made a call and he hadn't wanted to create friction. He said he was sorry, and he said it without qualification or excuse. Mara looked at him steadily. Not warm exactly, but not cold either. The steadiness of someone who understood that the person in front of her was genuinely contending with something real. "You listened before it was too late," she said. "That's what matters." Jason nodded and stepped back. There was nothing else that needed to be said, and Mara had a way of ending conversations that made people understand the exchange was complete. 2 other physicians who had been present when Gavin issued his order made their way to the nursing station over the next several minutes. Neither of them made speeches. One offered a brief and direct apology. The other simply asked Mara if she needed anything for the rest of her shift, which was its own kind of acknowledgement. Mara thanked them both and directed the conversation back to the floor. Daniel Frost appeared at the edge of the nursing station at 1:58. He picked up the suspension document from the counter, still face down exactly where Mara had placed it, folded it once and carried it back toward the administrative corridor without making eye contact with anyone. He didn't announce that the document was being withdrawn. He didn't issue a revised statement. The paper simply disappeared, and with it the official version of events that had begun with Gavin Mercer's order and ended with a brigadier general standing in an emergency department hallway at 1 a.m. Nobody on the floor needed it explained to them. Gavin found Mara near the medication station at 2:15. He had no entourage. His two associates had been asked politely, and without room for negotiation, to wait near the main entrance. He walked across the department floor alone, which was not a thing Gavin Mercer had done in a professional context, in a very long time moved through a space without the architecture of staff and support that had surrounded him for decades. He felt the absence of it acutely. He also understood somewhere in the part of himself that had built an empire by reading situations accurately when it mattered that arriving any other way would have been the wrong choice. Mara was checking a medication tray when he reached her. She looked up and held his gaze without expression, waiting. Gavin had prepared nothing. He had stood near the OR corridor for the better part of an hour, trying to construct something adequate, and had arrived at the conclusion that adequacy wasn't available to him in this situation. So he said the true thing. "Thank you," he said, "for saving my daughter." Mara set the tray down. "The surgeons saved her," she said. There was no false modesty in it. She meant it exactly as stated. The surgical team had done the work inside that room. That was accurate, and she was not interested in claiming otherwise. Gavin shook his head slowly. "They could only fix what you refused to ignore." Mara looked at him for a moment. Then she picked the tray back up and resumed her check. Not a dismissal, simply Mara returning to the work. Gavin understood that he had been answered, and that the answer was as complete as any answer he was going to receive tonight. He stood there a moment longer. Not because he had more to say, but because leaving felt too simple for what had occurred between them in the last several hours. Clean, an exit from something that had been anything but clean. Then he turned and walked back toward the waiting area alone, carrying the full weight of what it meant to have been wrong, in the way he had been wrong in front of the people who had witnessed it, about a person who had turned out to be exactly who she was. General Rourke left the hospital at 2:30. Before his team returned to the rooftop, he stopped at the front desk and spoke briefly with the overnight receptionist, a woman named Gloria who had worked the night window for 9 years and had seen most things and been surprised by very few of them. Rourke placed a small coin on the counter. It was an Army Challenge coin worn at the edges in the way objects get worn when they've been carried for a long time, and it bore a unit insignia that Gloria didn't recognize. He asked her to give it to Mara Ellison after her shift ended. He said Mara would not leave her patients to come down and receive it in person, and that he was not going to ask her to. Gloria looked at the coin, and then looked at the general and said she would make sure it got there. Rourke thanked her and walked toward the elevator. There was no ceremony, no press, no camera recording the departure of a Black Hawk from a hospital rooftop in the middle of the night. The aircraft lifted at 2:47 and banked north, and within 3 minutes the sound of it had dissolved completely into the city's ordinary noise. In the weeks that followed, Gavin Mercer worked with a small group of attorneys and financial advisors to establish an endowment structured as an independent foundation, funded to an initial sum sufficient to sustain decade-long programming directed toward advanced emergency training, trauma education, and nursing development at the resident and practicing level. He placed the foundation under independent governance. He specified in writing that his name was not to appear on any public-facing material associated with it. The attorneys noted the instruction and drafted the documents accordingly. It was not an act of penance. Gavin understood the distinction. Penance was performative. It was designed to be witnessed and to produce absolution. What he was doing was different. He was trying to build something that would outlast the night he had spent standing in a hallway, learning what it looked like when competence operated without an audience. He wasn't certain it was enough. He suspected it wasn't. But it was the most honest thing he knew how to do with what the experience had left him. The story of the Black Hawk spread through the hospital, the way certain stories spread, not through any official channel, but through the particular oral tradition of people who work night shifts together and share the things that happen in the hours when the rest of the city is asleep. New staff heard it during orientation week from someone who had been there. Residents heard it in break rooms. The detail that seemed to travel farthest to us was the salute a brigadier general, in the middle of the emergency department, rendered full formal honors to a woman who had gone back to checking medications before his hand had fully come down. Mara never corrected any version of the story. She also never added to it. Late on a Thursday evening, several weeks after the night Audrey Mercer had been wheeled into surgery, Mara was doing a final round of the floor before the shift change. The department was quiet in the particular way that emergency departments are occasionally briefly quiet, not because the need had gone away, but because it had for this hour paused. A medication cart had drifted from its position near Bay 4, rolled 1.5 feet into the corridor, at an angle that would catch a moving gurney wrong. Mara reached out one hand as she passed and stopped it. She straightened the cart, found a patient file slightly out of sequence in the rack on the side panel, and reordered it. She checked that the wheel brake was set correctly and pressed it down until it clicked. Then she gripped the handle, pushed the cart back to its position against the wall, and walked through the door to the next room. The door swung closed behind her. The hallway was empty and still and exactly as it needed to be. The most powerful people in the room aren't always the loudest ones. Sometimes they're the ones who stay focused when everyone else walks away, the ones doing the right thing even when no one is watching, even when it costs them something. If that kind of story stays with you, subscribe to this channel. We tell them every week. Share this one with someone who needs to hear it today.